Good morning, readers. Today we're going to start a new read aloud since we finished Freak the Mighty last Thursday or Wednesday, and then we talked about it Thursday. We're going to read a book called Tuck Everlasting, and this is actually the book that I sent home with you at the beginning of the year. I know some of you may have gotten a head start on it. I guess I can't stop you. It's too late now. But we're going to read this book, and I'm actually not going to show the book on the screen while I'm reading. It's just going to be my voice. So before you continue, go ahead and find that book and grab it so you can follow along. It would be really great if you could read along with me while I'm reading, and then we'll talk about some things at the end. Again, we're reading Tuck Everlasting, and you should have a copy of this because I gave a copy to everybody that first time we met when I gave you the big stack of books, and we're going to read this together. So I'm not going to show my video of the book. You're just going to hear my voice. But there will be some video at the end to watch. So we'll read, and then I'll talk about it and take some jots like usual. But I want you to follow along with your own text today. All right, let's get started. Natalie Babbitt, Tuck Everlasting. Prologue. You might be tempted to skip the prologue because it's not chapter 1, but prologues are usually really important and kind of set you up for what the story is going to be about. So we'll go ahead and read the prologue. The first week of August hangs at the very top of summer, the top of the livelong year, like the highest seat of a Ferris wheel when it pauses in its turning. The weeks that come before are only a climb from balmy spring, and those that follow a drop to the chill of autumn. But the first week of August is motionless and hot. It is curiously silent, too, with blank white dawns and glaring noons and sunsets smeared with too much color. Often at night there is a lightning, but it quivers all alone. There's no thunder, no relieving rain. These are strange and breathless days, the dog days, when people are led to do things they are sure to be sorry for after. So this story is probably going to take place during that August time, and that sentence, people are led to do things they are sure to be sorry for after, is kind of like foreshadowing that gives you like an ominous feel. One day at that time, not so very long ago, 3 things happened, and at first there appeared to be no connection between them. At dawn, May Tuck set out on her horse for the wood at the edge of the village of Tree Gap. She was going there as she did once every 10 years to meet her 2 sons, Miles and Jesse. At noontime, Winnie Foster, whose family owned the Tree Gap Wood, lost her patience at last and decided to think about running away. And at sunset, a stranger appeared at the Foster's gate. He was looking for someone, but he didn't say who. No connection, you would agree, but things can come together in strange ways. The wood was at the center, the hub of the wheel. All wheels must have a hub. A Ferris wheel has one, as the sun is the hub of the wheeling calendar. Fixed points they are, and best left undisturbed, for without them nothing holds together. But sometimes people find this out too late. Another sentence, kind of foreboding. Something's gonna happen. Let's move on. Chapter 1. The road that led to Tree Gap had been trod out long before by a herd of cows who were, to say the least, relaxed. It wandered along in curves and easy angles, swayed off and up into a pleasant tangent to the top of a small hill, ambled down again between fringes of bee-hung clover, and then cut sideways across a meadow. Here its edges blurred. It widened and seemed to pause, suggesting tranquil bovine picnics, slow chewing and thoughtful contemplation of the infinite. And then it went on again, and came at last to the wood. But on reaching the shadows of the first trees, it veered sharply, swung out in a wide arc as if for the first time it had reason to think where it was going, and passed around the wood. Remember, in the prologue it said the wood was in the center of these strange things, and that things should be left undisturbed. On the other side of the wood, the sense of easiness dissolved. The road no longer belonged to the cows. It became instead, and rather abruptly, the property of people. And all at once the sun was uncomfortably hot, the dust oppressive, and the meager grass along its edges somewhat ragged and forlorn. On the left stood the first house, a square and solid cottage with a touch-me-not appearance, surrounded by grass cut painfully to the quick and enclosed by a capable iron fence some 4 feet high, which clearly said, Move on, we don't want you here." So the road went humbly by and made its way, past cottages more and more frequent, but less and less forbidding, into the village. But the village doesn't matter, except for the jailhouse and the gallows. The first house only is important. The first house, the road, and the wood. Do you know what gallows are? Gallows are what they used to hang people on. Jailhouse and gallows. But the first house is important. Let's keep going. There was something strange about the wood. If the look of the first house suggested that you'd better pass it by, so did the look of the wood, but for quite a different reason. The house was so proud of itself that you wanted to make a lot of noise as you passed, and maybe even throw a rock or two. But the wood had a sleeping, otherworld appearance that made you want to speak in whispers. This, at least, is what the cows must have thought. Let it keep its peace. We won't disturb it. Because remember, the road goes around. Whether the people felt that way about the wood is not difficult to say. There were some, perhaps, who did, but for the most part, the people followed the road around the wood because that was the way it led. There was no road through the wood, and anyway, for the people, there was another reason to leave the wood to itself. It belonged to the Fosters, the owners of the Touch-Me-Not cottage, and it was therefore private property in spite of the fact that it lay outside the fence and was perfectly accessible. Have we heard of Foster before? If you turn to page 4, remember the second thing that was supposedly unconnected, Winnie Foster, whose family owned the Tree Gap Wood. The ownership of land is an odd thing when you come to think of it. How deep, after all, can it go? If a person owns a piece of land, does he own it all the way down in ever-narrowing dimensions till it meets all the other pieces at the center of the earth? Or does ownership only consist of a thin crust under which the friendly worms have never heard of trespassing? In any case, the wood, being on top, except of course for its roots, was owned bud and bough by the Fosters in the Touch-Me-Not cottage, and if they never went there, if they never wandered in among the trees, well, that was their affair. Winnie, the only child of the house, never went there, though sometimes she stood inside the fence, carelessly banging a stick against the iron bars, and looked at it, but she had never been curious about it. Nothing ever seems interesting when it belongs to you, only when it doesn't. And what is interesting anyway about a slim few acres of trees? There will be a dimness shot through with bars of sunlight, a great many squirrels and birds, a deep damp mattress of leaves on the ground, and all the other things just as familiar, if not so pleasant, things like spiders, thorns, and grubs. In the end, however, it was the cows who were responsible for the wood's isolation, and the cows, through some wisdom they were not wise enough to know they possessed, were very wise indeed. If they had made their road through the wood instead of around it, then the people would have followed the road. The people would have noticed the giant ash tree at the center of the wood, and then, in time, they'd have noticed the little spring bubbling up among its roots in spite of the pebbles piled there to conceal it. A spring is like a teeny tiny river. And that would have been a disaster so immense that this weary old earth, owned or not to its fiery core, would have trembled on its axis like a beetle on a pin. So that's another really kind of ominous foreboding thing. Thankfully, nobody has found that. Nobody went into the woods because otherwise they would have noticed the little spring bubbling up. So this spring is important. We'll go ahead and read one more chapter because they're pretty short. Chapter 2. And so at dawn, on the day in the first week of August, May Tuck woke up and lay for a while beaming at the cobwebs on the ceiling. At last she said aloud, "The boys will be home tomorrow." May's husband, on his back beside her, did not stir. He was still asleep, and the melancholy creases that folded his daytime face were smoothed and slacked. He snored gently, and for a moment the corners of his mouth turned up in a smile. Tuck almost never smiled except in sleep. May sat up in bed, and she looked at him tolerantly. "The boys will be home tomorrow," she said again, a little more loudly. Tuck twitched, and the smile vanished. He opened his eyes. "Why'd you have to wake me up?" he sighed. "I was having that dream again. The good one where we're all in heaven and never heard of Tree Gap." May sat there frowning, a great potato of a woman with round, sensible face and calm brown eyes. "It's no use having that dream," she said. "Nothing's going to change." "You tell me that every day," said Tuck, turning away from her onto his side. "Anyways, I can't help what I dream." Maybe not, said May, but all the same, you should have got used to things by now. Tuck groaned. I'm going back to sleep, he said. Not me, said May. I'm going to take the horse and go down to the wood to meet them. Meet who? The boys, Tuck, our sons. I'm going to ride down to meet them. Better not do that, said Tuck. I know, said May, but I just can't wait to see them. Anyways, it's 10 years since I went to Tree Gap. No one will remember me. I'll ride in at sunset just to the wood. I won't go into the village. But even if somebody did see me, they won't remember. They never did before now, did they? Suit yourself, then, said Tuck into his pillow. I'm going back to sleep. May Tuck climbed out of bed and began to dress. 3 petticoats, a rusty brown skirt with one enormous pocket, an old cotton jacket, and a knitted shawl that she pinned across her bosom with a tarnished metal brooch. The sounds of her dressing were so familiar to Tuck that he could say, without opening his eyes, You don't need that shawl in the middle of summer. May ignored his observation. Instead, she said, Will you be all right? We won't be back till late tomorrow. Tuck rolled over and made a rueful face at her. What in the world could possibly happen to me? That's so, said May. I keep forgetting. I don't, said Tuck. Have a nice time. And in a moment he was asleep again. May sat on the edge of the bed and pulled on a pair of short leather boots so thin and soft with age it was a wonder they held together. Then she stood and took from the washstand beside the bed a little square-shaped object, a music box painted with roses and lilies of the valley. It was the one pretty thing she owned, and she never went anywhere without it. Her fingers strayed to the winding key on its bottom, but glancing at the sleeping Tuck, she shook her head, gave the box a little pat, and dropped it into her pocket. Then, last of all, she pulled down over her ears a blue straw hat with a drooping, exhausted brim. But before she put on the hat, she brushed her gray-brown hair and wound it into a bun at the back of her neck. She did this quickly and skillfully without a single glance in the mirror. May Tuck didn't need a mirror, though she had one propped up on the washstand. She knew very well what she would see in it. Her reflection had long since ceased to interest her. For May Tuck and her husband, and Miles and Jessie too, had all looked exactly the same for 87 years. We're going to stop there. Did we read that right? They looked exactly the same for 87 years? Interesting. Very interesting. So, we don't know very much about the characters to do some of the in-depth analysis we've been doing in the classroom. So I'm just going to write some notes about the characters that we've met so far. So 19. Chapters 1 and 2. The prologue mentioned Winnie Foster. And then chapter 1, it mentions the cows. They're not really a character. The only thing it says about Winnie is that she's the only child, and she's not curious about the wood, because it says nothing ever seems interesting when it belongs to you, only when it doesn't. So I'll just write those 2 things, only child and not interested in the wood. Chapter 2, we met 2 characters. We have May Tuck and just Tuck, right? They just call him Tuck. He's probably has a first name, but we don't know what it is. May Tuck. So what do we know about them? Well, we know one interesting thing, which is that they haven't changed. They have been looking the same for 87 years. We know they have 2 sons. It seems like maybe May is a little more optimistic than Tuck, because he's kind of having this dream, and he wakes up and like, why did you wake me up? And she says, nothing's going to change. You should have been used to things by now. But he's still not used to whatever it is. I guess maybe looking the same. He goes back to sleep, but she's excited about seeing her sons. So let's just write, right now they kind of have the same information. They have 2 sons, and they've looked the same for 87 years. That is interesting. Very interesting.